Settlers are beating my mom for being Chinese. Please save her. But the cowboy took off her clothes and was shattered. What happens when a voiceless child watches a racist mob beat her mother in the frozen wasteland of the American frontier? You think you know, but when a silent, stone-cold cowboy finally intervenes, he doesn't draw a gun. He reaches for her clothes, and what he sees shatters his entire world, forging a bond of blood and vengeance that no one could have ever seen coming. The wind was a thief, stealing the sounds of my mother's pain before they could fully form in the frozen air. Her name was Mai, and her only crime was the elegant curve of her eyes, the gentle cadence of a language they refused to understand. The settlers' laughter was a crackle of breaking ice, their fists rising and falling against her small, resilient frame in the deepening twilight. I stood frozen, a small statue of terror, my own throat locked tight, the screams turning to ice in my lungs before they could be born. They called her a foreigner, a blight, their words as cruel as the lash of the wind that carried them. Blood, a stark, impossible red, stained the pristine snow around her, a flower of violence blooming in the desolate white. Just as the darkness seemed ready to swallow us whole, a new sound pierced the din of their hatred, the slow, deliberate, heavy crunch of boots on snow. A figure emerged from the swirling blizzard, a man who seemed carved from the very rock and ice of the mountain itself. His duster was caked with snow, his hat pulled so low it cast his face in a permanent, deep shadow. He did not shout. He did not draw a weapon. He simply walked forward, and his silence was more profound than any threat. It was a tangible thing, a heavy blanket that smothered the mob's jeers, their fists falling still by their sides. They shuffled back, their bravado shrinking under the immense, unreadable weight of his presence. He moved past them as if they were nothing more than dead trees, his gaze fixed on the broken form of my mother. He knelt in the blood-soaked snow, his large frame a sudden, dark shield between her and the world. I watched, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs, as a large, gloved hand reached out, the leather scarred and worn. With a tenderness that seemed utterly alien to his harsh form, he gently pushed aside the torn fabric of my mother's collar. And then he stopped. A stillness fell over him that was absolute, a pause that stretched into an eternity. From deep within his chest, a sound emerged, a guttural, choked noise of disbelief and ancient agony. For there, on my mother's bruised shoulder, was the brand. A dragon, its body coiled around a railroad spike. The men of the mob could not see it, but I could. And in that moment, the man's other hand, the gloved one, clenched so tightly that the old leather groaned in protest, a mirror image of the agony on my mother's skin, a secret shed in the flesh. His world, and mine, had just been irrevocably shattered and remade. The journey to his cabin was a fever dream, a desperate flight through the heart of the blizzard's fury. The man, this silent giant, had scooped my mother into his arms as if she weighed nothing, his one searing glance back at the stunned mob a silent promise of a reckoning yet to come. He had taken my small hand in his grip firm but not crushing, and pulled me into the swirling chaos of snow and wind. I could not feel the cold, the terror and the strange, burgeoning hope were afire in my veins. The wind howled like a legion of ghosts, tearing at us, trying to pull us down into the deep, white drifts. But he was relentless, a force of nature himself, his shoulders hunched against the gale, his every step a testament to an iron will. His cabin was not a home, it was a refuge, a burrow carved into the side of a hostile world. It was small, barely a single room, built of dark, rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and moss. Inside, the roar of the storm was muffled to a low, mournful moan. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth cold and black. The place smelled of pine, old smoke, and a deep, profound loneliness. He laid my mother gently on the sole piece of furniture that wasn't a crate, a narrow cot covered in patched furs. His movements were efficient, economical. He moved with a purpose that spoke of a life lived on the edge of survival. He lit a lantern, the soft, yellow light pushing back the oppressive shadows, revealing a face etched with lines of hardship, a jaw set like granite, and eyes that held the bleakness of the winter landscape. He stoked the embers in the hearth, skillfully coaxing them back to life until a small, determined fire began to crackle, its warmth a fragile miracle against the biting cold that had seeped into our bones. Then he turned his attention to my mother. He removed his gloves, and I saw his hand for the first time. The back of it was a roadmap of scars, but it was the brand on his palm, an exact mirror of the one on my mother's shoulder, that held my gaze. A dragon and a spike. He cleaned her wounds with a touch that was surprisingly delicate, his large, scarred fingers moving with the precision of a surgeon. He applied a dark, pungent salve from a small tin, his expression unreadable, a mask of concentration. I huddled in a corner, wrapped in a coarse wool blanket he had given me, watching every move, every subtle shift in his posture. The silence in the cabin was broken only by the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind, a long, slow conversation between the fragile safety within and the vast, violent wilderness without. My mother finally woke to the smell of pine smoke and the low crackle of a steady fire. Her eyes fluttered open, dark pools of confusion and pain in the pale landscape of her face. She tried to sit up, a sharp gasp escaping her lips as her bruised ribs protested. The man was there in an instant, a tin cup of steaming broth in his hand. He didn't speak, merely held it out to her. Their eyes met, and in that long, silent exchange, 1,000 questions were asked and none were answered. She looked at him, then at me, huddled by the fire, then around the stark, Spartan cabin. Her gaze finally fell upon his bare hand, resting on the rough-hewn table, the branded palm turned upward in the flickering firelight. Understanding, and a fresh wave of fear, washed over her face. I found my voice then, a small, reedy thing in the heavy silence. Why? The word was barely a whisper, directed at the mountain of a man who had saved us. Why did you help us? He turned his head slowly, his gaze falling upon me. It was not a cold look, but it was heavy, weighed down by things I couldn't comprehend. He didn't answer with words. Instead, he simply looked from me to my mother, and then pointed a single, scarred finger at the brand on his own hand. That was his only explanation. A shared mark of suffering. A history seared into their flesh. My mother, eventually drank the broth, her trembling hands guided by his steady ones. Later, after a long period of silence where the only sounds were the fire and the wind, she spoke, her voice hoarse. The railroad, she said, her eyes fixed on the dancing flames. Section foreman. He did not like my defiance. She didn't need to elaborate. The brand spoke for her, a testament to a cruelty that required no further description. The man listened, his jaw tight, a muscle twitching almost imperceptibly. He offered no story of his own, no words of comfort. He simply sat there, a silent sentinel, his presence a strange and complex mixture of menace and protection. The firelight cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, making the small space feel both like a prison and the safest place in the world. I watched them both, two wounded souls from different worlds, bound by a mark of subjugation, now sharing the same fragile warmth in the heart of a storm. A quiet question began to form in my mind, a seed of hope planted in the frozen ground of my fear. Would he let us stay? The storm raged for 3 days and 3 nights, locking us away from the world. The snow piled up in great, silent drifts against the cabin, sealing us in a cocoon of wood and warmth. In that enforced intimacy, a strange, unspoken rhythm began to form. Our protector, whose name I still did not know, became Cole, for that was the name my mother had heard one of the mob spit at him in accusation. Cole. It suited him. It sounded like cold stone and hard earth. His days were a ritual of survival. He would spend hours securing the cabin, checking the seals on the window shutters, reinforcing the heavy plank door. He had a small store of firewood inside, but he rationed it carefully, his every action measured and deliberate. He moved with a quiet efficiency that was mesmerizing. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation. He was a man who had stripped life down to its barest essentials: warmth, food, shelter. My mother, began to heal. Her spirit, though battered, was not broken. As her strength returned, she began to claim a small space in his solitary world. She took the broth he made and added wild herbs she found in a small pouch I had saved for her, transforming it from mere sustenance into something savory and comforting. She found a needle and thread in a dusty crate and began to meticulously mend the tears in our clothes, her small, neat stitches a quiet act of defiance against the chaos that had tried to consume us. She would hum a low, melancholic tune from a land we had left behind, the soft sound weaving itself into the fabric of the cabin's silence. I became the bridge between their two worlds of silence. I would watch Cole as he cleaned his rifle, his hands moving with an innate familiarity. I would watch Maya as she ground dried corn into flour, her expression serene and focused. I began to feel a sense of safety I hadn't known since before my father was lost to the snows 2 winters past. One afternoon, while Cole was checking the roof for the weight of the snow, I found a small block of soft pine and his discarded whittling knife. I sat by the fire, and for hours, I carved. My small, clumsy fingers worked the wood until it began to take the shape of a bird, a small, fat sparrow like the ones that used to flit around our old home. That evening, I crept over to his bedroll, a simple pile of furs in the corner, and placed the small wooden bird on it. I scurried back to my own spot, my heart hammering. I watched him through my lashes as he returned from the cold. He saw the bird. He picked it up, his large fingers dwarfing it. He ran a thumb over its rough surface. For the briefest of moments, the hard line of his mouth softened. He didn't say anything. He simply placed the bird in his coat pocket, keeping it close. On the 4th morning, we awoke to an almost deafening silence. The wind had finally died. Cole unbarred the door, and the light that streamed in was so bright, so pure, it made us blink. The world outside had been remade, a landscape of breathtaking, treacherous beauty. The snow was a thick, seamless blanket, covering everything in a shroud of white, the sunlight glittering off its surface like a million scattered diamonds. But the beauty held a sharp, dangerous edge. This pristine world was not empty. Cole's gaze was not on the majestic peaks or the sun-drenched valleys. It was on the details. A disturbance in the snow on a distant ridge. The unnatural stillness of a copse of aspens. He could read the landscape like a book, and it was telling him a story of impending violence. He knew they would come. The mob's hatred was not the kind to be cooled by a storm, it would have festered, grown hotter in their confinement. Now, with the weather cleared, they would be hungry for the vengeance they felt they were owed. The slow burn of our quiet sanctuary was about to end. The air grew tense, the unspoken peace of the last few days evaporating like mist in the morning sun. Cole began his preparations. There was a new urgency to his movements, a grim purpose in every action. He brought out a second rifle, old but well-maintained, and a small box of cartridges. He checked the heavy bar on the door, tested the strength of the window shutters. He was turning our small refuge into a fortress. Maya watched him, her face pale, the old fear returning to her eyes. But this time, it was different. It was mingled with a fragile trust. She didn't shrink away. She went to his side, picked up a rag, and began to methodically clean the second rifle, her movements copying the one she had seen him make. She was no longer just a victim to be protected, she was a partner in this desperate stand. I felt the cold dread coiling in my stomach. I went to him as he was inspecting a loose board near the hearth, my small wooden bird clutched in my hand. "Are they coming back?" I whispered, the question that had been haunting my dreams. He stopped what he was doing and looked down at me. His shadowed face was impossible to read, but his voice, when it came, was low and certain, a gravelly rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. "They are," he said. And in those 2 words, I heard the finality of a death sentence and the unwavering promise of a shield. The last night of peace fell like a shroud. The sky outside was a deep, star-dusted indigo, the snow glowing with a soft, ethereal light. Inside the cabin, the fire was the only source of warmth, painting our faces in flickering shades of orange and red. The air was thick with unspoken fear, so heavy it felt hard to breathe. We sat close together, a small, temporary island of humanity against a rising tide of hate. Sleep was a distant shore none of us could reach. I held my small wooden bird so tightly its sharp edges dug into my palm. I looked at Cole, who was staring into the flames as if he could see the future in their dance. The brand on his hand seemed to glow darker in the firelight. My childish curiosity, for a moment, overcame my fear. "Does it hurt?" I asked, my voice small, pointing to the mark on his skin. He looked down at his hand, then at mine. For a long moment, I thought he wouldn't answer. He rarely spoke more than 2 or 3 words at a time. But then, he began to speak, his voice a low, rough thing, like stones grinding together, a voice unused to telling stories. "It did," he said. "A long time ago. Now, it's just a reminder." He told us of a time before the silence, before the solitary cabin. A time when he worked laying track for the great iron horse, blasting through mountains of granite, his hands raw and bleeding. He spoke of the railroad company, of foremen who were more like slave drivers, who saw the workers not as men, but as tools to be used and discarded. He spoke of the Chinese crews, segregated, given the most dangerous jobs and the worst provisions. He had tried to stand up for them, for a friend he had made, a man named Chen. They had been accused of stealing, a false charge to make an example of them. They were held down, the branding iron glowing cherry red in the fire. "They made us an example," Cole rasped, his eyes distant, lost in the memory. "They called it company property, marked us like cattle." He never said what happened to Chen. He didn't have to. The pain and loss were raw in his voice, a wound that had never truly healed. My mother listened, her own eyes glistening with unshed tears. She reached out, her small, delicate hand tentatively covering his scarred one on the table. It was not a gesture of pity, but of profound, shared understanding. 2 separate lives, 2 continents of origin, brought together by the same cruel mark of oppression. He didn't pull away. He simply sat there, his hand under hers, the firelight catching the glint of a single tear that traced a path through the grime on his cheek. In that moment, in that quiet confession before the battle, we were no longer a stranger, a victim, and a child. We were a family. They came in the grey, bloodless light of pre-dawn. Not with shouts and drunken rage, but with a chilling, organized silence. They moved like a pack of wolves, dark shapes flitting between the snow-laden trees, their torches held low, casting long, monstrous shadows that danced across the white expanse. Cole had been awake all night, a silent silhouette by the window, watching, waiting. The first sign of their arrival was not a sound, but a feeling, a subtle shift in the pre-dawn stillness, the air growing heavy with menace. Then came the soft thump of an arrow embedding itself in the cabin's log wall, followed by another, and another. They were trying to find a weakness, to test the defenses. Inside, the small space was a tinderbox of tension. Cole moved with a lethal grace, his earlier preparations now a deadly choreography. He motioned for Mai and me to take cover behind a heavy overturned table in the corner furthest from the windows. Mai clutched the second rifle, her knuckles white, her face a mask of determined terror. The attackers grew bolder. A torch arced through the air, landing on the sod roof with a soft whoosh. The smell of smoke began to snake into the cabin. Cole didn't waste ammunition. He waited, his breathing slow and steady, watching through a small crack in the window shutter. He was waiting for a clear target, for one of them to expose themselves. A man broke from the tree line, a heavy axe in his hands, charging toward the door. The crack of Cole's rifle was deafening in the enclosed space. The man fell, a dark stain spreading on the snow. The attack faltered for a moment, then redoubled with furious shouts. They were no longer silent. They hammered on the door, their voices a chorus of hate. Splinters of wood flew inward. Cole moved away from the window, pressing his back against the wall next to the door, his pistol now in his hand. The bar on the door groaned, the wood beginning to split. The noise was apocalyptic, the splintering of wood, the enraged shouts of the mob, the roar of the growing fire on the roof, and the sharp, repeating cracks of Cole's pistol as he fired through the weakening door. It was a symphony of destruction, and we were trapped in its heart. The battle raged, a brutal, close-quarters affair of survival. The heavy wooden bar on the door finally shattered under a coordinated assault, and the door flew open, revealing the hate-twisted faces of the settlers, their eyes gleaming in the light of their torches. Cole met them not as a man, but as a cornered animal, a whirlwind of desperate violence. He used his empty rifle as a club, swinging the heavy stock with savage force, driving the first 2 men back. A knife flashed, and Cole grunted in pain, a dark line of red appearing on his forearm. He ignored it, his focus absolute. He was a wall of fury, a barrier of flesh and bone between us and them. But they were too many. They swarmed him, dragging him down. I screamed, a raw, piercing sound of pure terror. That sound seemed to cut through the chaos and reach him. With a roar that was more beast than man, he surged upward, throwing them off. He was bleeding now from a cut on his temple, the blood mingling with the sweat and grime on his face. He fought with a ferocity born of a lifetime of pain and a newfound purpose. He was not just fighting for his own life, he was fighting for the flicker of hope that had been kindled in this cabin, for the woman who shared his scar, for the child who had carved him a bird. From our corner, Mai raised the rifle. Her hands were shaking, but her aim was true. She fired, the recoil slamming the stock into her shoulder, but one of the attackers clutched his leg and fell back. It was not enough. They were pushing Cole back, step by bloody step. The fire on the roof was burning hotter, embers raining down into the cabin. Smoke filled the air, thick and acrid. The sanctuary was becoming a tomb. One of the men, the leader, a burly man with a face like a slab of raw meat, broke past Cole, his eyes locking onto Mai and me. He grinned, a cruel, triumphant slash in his beard. Now, he growled, raising his axe. All hope seemed to die in that moment, consumed by the smoke and the hate. Cole screamed my mother's name, a sound of pure agony and despair. And then, the mountain answered. It began as a low, deep rumble, a vibration felt more in the bones than in the ears. It was a sound so profound, so elemental, that it momentarily silenced the chaos of the fight. The settlers paused, their faces turning from triumphant cruelty to confusion. The rumbling grew, escalating with terrifying speed into a deafening, all-consuming roar. It was the sound of the world tearing itself apart. Through the broken doorway, the sky seemed to tilt. The pristine, white face of the mountain above us was moving, a colossal wave of snow, ice, and rock detaching itself and hurtling downwards with unimaginable speed and power. The gunfire, the shouting, the crackle of the fire, it was all swallowed by the godlike thunder of the avalanche. It was nature's judgment, swift and absolute. A tidal wave of white oblivion descended upon the clearing. The men outside looked up, their faces frozen in masks of terror for one final, silent moment before they were erased, swept away, and buried under 1,000,000 tons of snow. The wave struck the cabin, and the world exploded into a vortex of splintering wood, roaring wind, and crushing pressure. The last thing I saw was Cole launching himself towards us, his body a shield, as the darkness took us. Silence. A profound, ringing silence that was deeper than the absence of sound. It was the silence of a world wiped clean. We awoke buried in a pocket of debris, miraculously alive. The cabin had been torn apart, but a section of the roof and a solid wall had held, creating a small, dark space around us. Cole was on top of us, his body having taken the brunt of the collapse. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow. The air was thick with the dust of splintered wood and the cold, clean scent of deep snow. For hours, Mai and I worked, digging our way out with bare, bleeding hands. We finally broke through into the blinding light of a new day. The world was unrecognizable. Where there had been a clearing, trees, and a mob of angry men, there was now only a vast, smooth, and utterly silent sea of white. The avalanche had scoured the landscape, burying everything, erasing the ugliness, the violence, the hate. It was a tomb and a blank page. We managed to pull Cole out into the sunlight. His wounds were severe, but he was alive. We tended to him as he had tended to us, using torn strips of our own clothing for bandages. We huddled together for warmth on the wreckage of our brief home, the sun climbing higher in a sky that was a piercing, indifferent blue. The threat was gone. The mountain had delivered a brutal, impartial justice. We were alone, but we were alive. We were battered, and we had lost our shelter, but we had survived. As the sun began to set, casting long, purple shadows across the endless snow, Cole finally stirred. His eyes fluttered open, and the first thing he saw was us, safe. A look of profound relief washed over his battered features. He looked at the devastation around us, at the pristine white tomb of his enemies, and then his gaze settled on my mother. No words were needed. Everything was communicated in that one look, a shared history, a shared battle, a shared survival. He then looked at me, his expression softening. I wasn't afraid anymore. I walked over and placed my small hand on his uninjured one. The question that had been my constant companion had changed. It was no longer a plea for safety. Safety was a place we would have to build ourselves. "Where will we go?" I asked, my voice clear and steady in the vast silence. Cole pushed himself to a sitting position, wincing in pain. He didn't look back at the ruin of his past. He looked forward, towards the distant peaks of the horizon, towards the vast, unknown expanse of the frontier. He squeezed my hand gently, and for the first time, I saw the ghost of a smile touch his lips. He didn't have an answer, but in his eyes, I saw not an end, but a beginning. We were a family, born of fire and ice, and our path was forward, together, into the rising sun. Hey there, partner. What you just heard was a story about how the deepest scars, the ones that mark us on the inside and out, don't have to be endings. Sometimes, they're the very things that lead us to the people we were meant to protect, the family we were meant to find. It's about how even in the coldest, most hateful wilderness, three broken souls can find enough warmth in each other to build a new world. If you were moved by the story of how a silent man's promise was answered by a mountain's fury, make sure you stick around. We've got another tale of frontier justice coming up that you won't want to miss.